Good evening. I'm Scott Fleming. I'm Associate Vice President for Federal Relations here at Georgetown, and it is a real pleasure to welcome all of you to campus tonight. This evening's topic of exploration is one that is quintessentially Georgetown, as an institution which is not only the oldest Catholic and Jesuit university in the United States, but also one that in its 225 years of existence, since being founded in 1789, has produced a broad array of public leaders, I see one right here, of both political parties. Today, 20 Georgetown alumni serve in the United States Congress, 6 in the Senate, 14 in the House of Representatives. They include representatives of both major political parties and a wide ideological spectrum, from the most conservative to the most liberal members of both bodies. Those and other Georgetown-educated leaders live day to day in the crosshairs of partisanship and struggle with how to bridge that divide. And I can tell you that this campus is one where bipartisanship truly thrives. Our college Democrats and college Republicans plan events together year in and year out. In fact, in the late 1990s, the presidents of those two organizations were Georgetown roommates, and they've remained friends as they pursued careers as Capitol Hill staffers for members of Congress who have, more often than not, been diametrically opposed. In short, this evening's program is one that builds on the culture and the values of this institution. We are glad you are here, especially at this busy time of year. We would ask that everyone please silence their cell phones so as not to interrupt the program. The evening will begin with opening remarks by Bishop McElroy, followed by a bipartisan panel of individuals who have extensive experience operating the halls of power in Washington. Following the panel discussion, there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience, and the evening will conclude with reflections from two seasoned members of Congress, Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, Democrat of Ohio, and Congressman Walter Jones, Republican of North Carolina. Both have dealt with the challenges of diverging from party orthodoxy on some key issues while maintaining their ability to navigate effectively within their own parties. To get this program underway, I would like to introduce Bishop Robert McElroy, Auxiliary Bishop of the Archdiocese of San Francisco. Bishop McElroy earned degrees from St. Patrick's Seminary and University, Harvard, Stanford, and the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He has taught at the university level and authored 2 books and numerous articles. In an article last year reflecting on Bishop McElroy's article in America magazine entitled "Pope Francis Makes Addressing Poverty Essential," Michael Sean Winters described Bishop McElroy as, quote, "a bishop who gets Francis, but who also gets American culture." He also called Bishop McElroy one of the finest bishops in the United States. He went on to make the point that he, quote, "is the first prelate to explicitly and authoritatively challenge the use," or he added, better to say the misuse, of Catholic moral theology in discussions of public policy. Please join me in welcoming Bishop McElroy.
And I just want to open by saying it's an honor to be here and be part of this new tradition, this profound tradition, which John Carr and the Berkeley Institute have founded here. And I want to give my support for it and say what a contribution it makes to the life of the church and to the life of society. Thank you, John. Catholic teaching views the vocation of politics as a vital element in the building up of the kingdom of God on earth. Just as democracy is not merely a set of empty procedures, but instead the promotion of the dignity of the human person, respect for human rights, and the commitment to the common good, so too the vocation of the political leader is a profoundly moral one. It is rooted in the commitment to share fully in the destiny of the people while seeking solutions to society's deepest problems. It seeks to put power into practice as service. As Pope Francis noted last September, politics, according to the social doctrine of the Church, is one of the highest forms of charity because it serves the common good in humility and in love. It is this inherent dignity of political leadership and the countless sacrifices that public officials are called to make in their daily lives for the service of our nation, which compel us to thank and acknowledge tonight all those who respond to the great call of public service in our society. And it is out of a profound respect for the enormously complex questions of conscience and moral choice that political leaders face repeatedly in their vocation that we gather together and reflect upon the issue of what role party politics can and should play in the decision of our political leaders at this moment in our history. The moral end of politics is the achievement of the common good in society. The Second Vatican Council defined this central but complex concept of the common good as, quote, the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. In seeking the common good, the Council said, every group must take into account the needs and legitimate aspirations of every other group, and still more of the human family as a whole. It was this emphasis on the unity of the common good which led many of our nation's founders to conclude that political parties, or factions as they preferred to call them, were totally antithetical to the pursuit of the common good. For them, the concept of faction was rooted in the effort to formulate public policy around the views and interests of one segment of society over against another. Parties were necessarily divisive in their worldviews, their political structures, and their objectives. In an age like our own, when partisan divides seem so often to hobble public policy rather than advance it, the echoes of these early American critics of partisanship in American politics raise the perennial question of whether parties truly serve the democratic process or impede it. Yet in the most important crises in our nation's history, political party structures have transformed and advanced the common good in profound ways. In 1860, the Republican Party of Free Soil, Free Labor, and Free Men cobbled together the coalition that elected Abraham Lincoln and forced America to confront the continuation of slavery, that original sin of the American founding. And in the wake of the Great Depression, the Democratic coalition transformed the nature of the federal government in order to erect a social safety net that reached out to every corner of the land with jobs and food and electricity. The moral achievements of party structures appear no less in the moments of our nation's history when bipartisan action has led to revolutions that monumentally advanced the common good and basic human dignity. The progressive reforms that emerged from the republicanism of Theodore Roosevelt and the democratic politics of Woodrow Wilson, and the bipartisan coalition that wrought the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s testified to the reality of the fact that party structures can produce a level of moral cooperation that propels the common good of society even as it reflects party identity. Catholic social teaching envisions a vital role for political parties in the advancement of politics and the common good. In the words of the Vatican's Compendium on Catholic Social Teaching, quote, political parties have the task of fostering widespread participation and making public responsibilities accessible to all. Political parties are called to interpret the aspirations of civil society, orienting them toward the common good, offering citizens the effective possibility of contributing to the formulation of political choices, unquote. Thus, in Catholic teaching, the genius of parties is that they serve two essential goals in a democratic society. First of all, they have a uniquely powerful ability to stimulate participation by large numbers of citizens at all levels in political decision-making. Secondly, they act as moral sifters in the formulation of public policy, lifting up the longings and the insights of women and men and providing specific avenues for them to change public policy to more fully protect human dignity. But if the capacity of parties to generate and sustain widespread political participation and produce reforms in public policy make parties a beneficial element of American politics, the excesses of political partisanship make it essential that all public officials have a strictly conditioned fidelity to their party identity. Party structures accelerate the tendency to value victory over compromise, electoral advantage over substantive accomplishment, and power over principle. Party structures can at times deliberately call upon legislators to place partisan loyalties above the clear common good in the hope of attaining partisan political advantage. Even more frequently, party pressures can distort legislators' very comprehension of the common good because of the immensely powerful human instinct that we all have to convince ourselves that what is the best option for us really is the morally correct option also. For Catholic social teaching, the current structure of American political parties bisects the common good. The Republican Party better reflects the commitment to protect unborn life, reject euthanasia, and promote religious liberty. The Democratic Party witnesses more effectively to Catholic teachings on the issues of poverty and inequality, immigration reform, restorative justice, and the environment. On the critical questions of family life, each party reflects certain key elements of the core common good, while on the issues to address global poverty and the fundamental question of the role of welfare in American foreign policy, neither party embodies even an acceptable threshold of what Catholic social teaching calls for. The commitment to the protection of human life from conception to natural death and the option for the poor have become particularly important principles in the present moment, not only because they go to the very heart of the common good, but also because the rejection of the first has become a virtual litmus test for democratic leadership, while a rejection of the second is increasingly becoming a litmus test for Republican allegiance. For these reasons, voters guided by Catholic social teaching are left with a deeply conflicted attachment to particular parties today. In many ways, all voters, legislators, members of the executive branch, and party leaders who dedicate their lives to seeking the common good are inevitably left in a continuing state of conditioned commitment to their party's agenda. They are called to embrace fully those areas of party life which contribute to the common good, which deepen the ability of their party to elicit and enflesh broad participation by citizens in the political life of the nation, and also to act at times as insurgents within their own parties, to bring their party's positions and influence into closer conjunction with the deeply moral vision of advancing the dignity of the human person. Recognizing these realities, the following 6 principles, I would suggest, are guideposts for fostering party structures which reflect a moral commitment to the common good. Number 1, political parties in their core moral identity are called to nourish the broad and meaningful participation of citizens in the formulation of public policy choices and the selection of candidates. This breadth of participation is a goal which must take precedence over the expansion of political contributions, the recruitment of candidates, and at times over electoral advantage itself. Number 2, The political culture of our nation should not only allow public officials to at times make policy choices of conscience which are at variance with their party's positions, but our political culture should also recognize such moments of conscience as a mark of leadership and devotion to public service, rather than a failure of loyalty to party. 3, there must be an examination of structures in our current partisan life and governance which contribute to the tendency to foster gridlock over governmental accomplishments that will advantage the common good. Structures which powerfully favor partisan electoral advantage over good governance should be reformed. 4th, there is great social peril in the fact that today our party structure is sharply divided along lines of race and ethnicity. This is not a new development in American politics, of course, but it strikes at the very heart of the social compact, which is essential for the preservation of the common good in our nation. Both political parties have a deep responsibility to minimize and assuage these racial and ethnic divisions and not to exacerbate them for electoral benefit. 5th, parties must find pathways to overcome and transform the pressures to be dominated by money. The pursuit of the common good is both a substantive endeavor and a highly symbolic one for society. The current role of money in our partisan and political life is a threat on both levels. Finally, the history of political parties in the U.S. is a proud one, which has dramatically advanced the common good, creatively brought forth new solutions to profound crises, and enlisted the broad base of the American public more intimately in the process of their own governance. Our parties need to bring this reality to the new generation in order to carry on party life as a critically important part of American public life, and even more essentially, to renew it. I close with the words of Pope Francis, quote, "Let us not forget that responsible citizenship is a virtue, and participation in political life is a moral obligation. I ask God to give us more politicians capable of sincere and effective dialogue, aimed at healing the deepest roots and not simply the appearances of the evils in our world."
Thank you, Bishop McElroy. Indeed, you have beautifully framed this evening's program. I'm pleased now to introduce my good friend and the man who conceptualized and brought tonight's program to reality, John Carr. Many of you know John well, and that is not surprising given his long career of leadership in the cause of Catholic social justice. From his role as program coordinator of the Twin Cities Urban Corps and legislative coordinator for the Urban Affairs Commission of the St. Paul, Minneapolis Archdiocese, to his roles as executive director of both the National Committee for Full Employment and of President Carter's White House Conference on Families, John Carr started his career shaping issues of importance to the church and to the nation. For more than 2 decades, as executive director of the Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, he served as what the Washington Post once called the most important policy advisor to the country's bishops. And today, I am so glad to say John continues to make a tremendous difference as director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life here at Georgetown. With thanks for his leadership here on our campus and for his work making sure that important conversations like we are having tonight are taking place, it is my pleasure to introduce my good friend, John Carr.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott, very much. For those of you that are in the back, this looks a little like Sunday Mass. There's no one down in the front pew, and so there's room down here if you want to join us. Let me just say a word of thanks and a word about the initiative and then turn to tonight's topic and panel. First of all, thank you for coming. It's a very busy time. And to have a turnout like this on a topic, what I've learned is the Pope is an easier sell than politics, but there are a lot of people very much concerned about the morality of political life. I want to thank Scott, who has been a great example of the way in which Georgetown has welcomed our initiative. You can imagine the conversation when, because of dates and everything else, I said to Scott, we have this great idea. We're going to have this panel on the morality of partisanship on the day classes end, on the night Congress comes back from a recess at 7:15 in the evening. And he said, you know, we'll make it work. And it's working. I also want to thank Bishop McElroy for his eloquent, thoughtful, frankly challenging outline he gave us. He wrote a book called The Search for American Public Theology, The Contribution of John Courtney Murray. I have the sense that we've heard a contribution to American public theology tonight that will serve us well. The initiative is a little more than 6 months old. What we have done so far is this is our fifth dialogue, our fourth major public dialogue. 3 on the Holy Father, the poor, politics, and the Francis factor. 1 on humanitarian intervention, and now on the moral dimensions of public life. We're reaching out to young people in Washington to have them see their faith as an asset, not a burden, as they serve the common good. We're working with evangelicals and Catholic leaders to demonstrate that Catholic social thought can in fact bring people together across partisan and partisan lines to help lift up the poor, and we're doing other things. This has moved from an idea, a dream, into, I think, a very promising, a very encouraging sign of dialogue, and tonight is no exception to that. This is not your typical Washington partisanship discussion. We are not going to examine how partisanship has grown or less cooperation across the aisle, deploring the partisan war rooms that have developed, the constant use of the filibuster, the damage of the Hassett rule, all those things where people sort of wring their hands. We're going to take a different look at this, which is what does partisanship do to participants in political life? How does it affirm them? How does it challenge them? How does it allow them to fulfill their vocation? In what ways does it leave them on their own in fulfilling that vocation? This is not your typical Washington panel either. Not many panels have a professor of theology who was a press secretary while a president underwent impeachment. Not many panels have an African-American Republican officeholder candidate and party chairman who debated with Rush Limbaugh who spoke for the Republican Party. Not many panels have a pro-life Democratic member of Congress who took on an incumbent of her own party to become county executive in her own community. And not many panels have a no-labels Republican who served as a political advisor to both Ann Richards and George W. Bush. The people at this table have, and tonight who are here, have lost committee assignments. They've left campaigns. They've gotten in considerable trouble. They've had their loyalty and integrity questioned, and they have fulfilled the vocation that Bishop McElroy talked about so eloquently. So you can see in the program the specifics, and I'm going to share a little bit about each later on, but I would like to ask each of you, and I'll go down the line, a very general question. In light of your diverse experience, what are the primary moral obligations of a partisan, a Republican, a Democrat, a consultant, an advocate, a campaign leader? You're called to win, you're called to prevail on an issue. What are the affirmative responses of a partisan? What are you supposed to do? And what are the limitations, moral limitations on partisan? What should you not do to win an election or to advance a cause? Let's turn to Mike first.
It's a great series of troubling questions, and it makes it difficult to answer because of the uncertain condition of partisanship in this country right now. We've got ourselves worked into a place where the divide and the polarization between the parties, particularly among those who are the elected leadership, is greater than it maybe has ever been. You could argue, maybe historians would argue a little bit with that. And at the same time, the agendas of the parties are so uncertain and unclear that it's not always sure what it is that you're fighting for other than the next campaign and victory. And I think that is where you have to start this discussion. What is it that a partisan owes to the party beyond allegiance, loyalty, the sense that that label conveys with it a community that you're a part of and that you support, because it's necessary in order to bring some kind of balance to our public discussion. So you have a duty of loyalty to that party to stand for what it stands for, and then there's the problem, because what is that? And I think you also have some responsibility to try to bring that community to a point of view that reflects the moral and value and ethical propositions that you as the individual bring into the discussion, so that you don't let the party drift into a direction that you don't agree with. And you fight hard, if you're a pro-life Democrat, to get the party to recognize different things about an issue that is so troubling to so many millions, and not accept orthodoxy without some challenge. So therein kind of lies the answer that I would give, which is that you've got to stand for something and fight for what it should be, and make clear what the party believes. But then you have to adhere to that and try to advance something that brings people together and rallies people around. We live, as everyone knows now, in an age of politics in where the premium and the excitement is the technical ability to micro-target messages directly to the voter and slice and dice the electorate so fine that you cobble together some kind of winning strategy. Well, parties is what brings those slices back together to reach 50%. So they're important in bringing us together to some point where we can begin to believe that we've plotted a direction, we have a vision, we know where we want to go. And of course, that depends on the other party having some vision that contests and provides an alternative, so that there's an honest choice. That's kind of my initial thoughts, is that those are things that maybe we need that are frankly missing from our politics now.
Kathy, you've been in the Congress, you're now a county executive. What are the limitations? What are the obligations of a partisan? I'm
going to speak from a very personal standpoint on probably a lot of things I say tonight. When I first ran for Congress, it was 2008. I started running in 2007. I had never run for any election except for school council, I think, back in high school. And so I was 50 years old, and I was jumping into politics, and I was running for Congress. And I was in a primary with 3 other men. There's 4 of us in that primary, and we all wanted to take on a 14-year incumbent. And I was questioned during my debates by these other gentlemen from my own party whether I was a true Democrat. How can you be pro-life and be a Democrat? And that was the litmus test. It didn't matter where I stood on any other issue within the party. And I think that's one of the struggles. And whether it's abortion or whether it's some other wedge issue, those are the issues that too often are the litmus test when the partisan can be supportive of the party in so many ways. And I could go through that, and we could talk about social justice, and we could talk about the environment, and we could talk about many, many other issues that I sit with my party on very firmly, and yet the one issue becomes the wedge.
Michael, beyond the 10 Commandments, and I guess when you think about it, maybe we ought to start there. Thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet, a variety of things.
Why are you bringing this up with me?
Beyond those bottom lines.
What is it about the 10 Commandments?
What are the obligations? What are the limitations in your experience?
Well, it's a challenge, certainly. to run, particularly running a national party, because you've got everything magnified 3,000 times what it is under normal circumstances. I started out in politics here in Washington, D.C., and my orientation was driven by two very important factors. One was my faith tradition, Roman Catholic, and my mama's belt. And so between Maybell's belt and the teachings of the church, it sort of fashioned for me sort of the basis of how one engages in public space. And when I became county chairman in Prince George's County and then state chairman, I realized that that base becomes even more important to you because foundationally you need to stand on something. You need to stand on something a lot firmer than a party platform, because a party platform is a very transitory thing. It's all how you feel at the moment and whether or not you have enough votes to get that particular plank in or out. But if you don't have anything to stand on that's stronger than that, then it becomes a very difficult relationship between you and your party. That was discovered for me more broadly as national chairman when in the course of pursuing, and so I can identify what Kathy was just saying, the chairmanship, I was challenged by members of my own party as to whether or not I had the real bona fides as a conservative on the question of life. And I just looked at them quizzically. It's like, well, where is this coming from? I mean, if you know anything about my backstory, if you know anything about my own personal journey, you understand why I am pro-life. I'm an adopted child whose mom made a very important decision that wound up being important for both of us. And so she had choices that she had to make. And fortunately, she, lived the gospel, at least the teaching of Deuteronomy, and chose life. So to be questioned about that, running for an office like chairman of the RNC, to me was a little bit off-putting. But it told me at the same time of what the real battle lines were going to be. That there are forces within the party who feel threatened, that their influence and their ability to persuade on this issue has diminished. There are others who see opportunity to sort of come in and push those forces aside and to reestablish or to establish a different kind of presence. And so the challenge became one of understanding foundationally why the party, argues for the life position, and the bishop, I thought, touched on that. But at the same time, not losing sight of the fact that not everybody's going to be in that space with you. So tying those knots together for me was a real hard thing to do, but for the fact that I had this foundation that allowed me to go into a room in the morning and have a conversation with a lot of folks screaming that I wasn't doing enough on the pro-life effort, and then go into a room in the afternoon and have a lot of folks screaming at me that I was doing too much on the pro-life effort, and not paying attention to those in the party who weren't necessarily pro-life, and then deciding, why don't we just have a meeting and y'all just come together and we talk about this. And so, but it's that foundation for me, which is the key thing that I think helps you navigate through these waters and really have a sixth sense, if you will, of understanding how all these pieces should fit together, and then trying to move the party in that position so that the foundation that is established, this platform, and the planks that is taken are upheld, but you also recognize that the landscape is still changing around you, and the party has to adapt to that as well.
Mark, you've been a Democrat, a Republican, and you're not a Catholic. So what are you doing here? No.
I'm the black sheep of the family.
Yeah. What's your take on the obligations and limitations?
It's such a great question and great remarks, Bishop. Really captured so much. I'd love to get a copy of that. It's a lot to think about. I'm going to do what Kathy did and just tell you a personal story that I think reflects on your question the best way that I can articulate it. And so I'm trying to think of that question from a consultant's point of view. And now you said a Democrat and now a Republican, which is true, but I want to clarify that. It's not like I bounced back and forth. I was for 15 years working in Democratic politics, had a personal and political evolution over time, and became a Republican, and a proud one, which I've been for the last 15 years. And I worked for both George W. Bush's presidential campaigns. I was the media and advertising guy. And then I worked for John McCain, but something interesting happened during that campaign that goes to your question. I had known John McCain, and for all the reasons that you might know about John McCain, just thought he was a true patriot and a real servant of democracy, and thought that at some point in my life I'd like to serve him, as he talks about, serve a cause greater than yourself. So he asked if I'd help in his 2008 campaign, and I happily agreed to do so. But I had a big caveat, which was this. I had met Barack Obama, and I liked him. I liked him a lot, and I disagreed with his politics quite a bit. But I thought his candidacy would be good for the country. I thought an African American running for president would be good for the country, and so I realized that, and I thought he had a lot of character. I mean, I thought he was a man of deep character, and would be a good candidate. But so I realized that if McCain won the nomination and Obama won the nomination, and remember, this is 2 years before, so that seemed like a very unlikely scenario. I realized that I would be uncomfortable being in the position of attacking this candidate, Barack Obama, which would be my job. And this has to do with kind of the evolution of our campaigns, too. I knew it was going to get really ugly. And it was going to be, put on the brass knuckles. And I realized that I was not going to be comfortable doing that. It was not going to be for the common good, in my view. It was, now, again, I was totally committed to John McCain. I was going to vote for John McCain under any circumstances. But I wrote him a memo the first day that I started, to him and the staff, and I said, if it happens that you're nominated, Barack Obama is nominated, I'm going to step out of the general election. And I'm still going to vote for you, support you, but I'm not going to be your wingman attacking Barack Obama because A, I'd be uncomfortable doing it, B, I don't think it'd be good for the campaign. I'm not the right guy. Well, flash forward, a year and a half later, and that happens. Of course, McCain had forgotten about it. And I kind of go up and I wave the memo, and he goes, oh, God, I forgot about that. And but he gave me a big hug, and he said it'd be totally un-McCain-like to do anything different. And so, I walked off into the sunset. So that was a decision that I made that I thought, for my purposes, was better. I mean, it was a moral sort of decision, and I gave up a lot of money by doing that. And I had to tell my wife, "You're not getting that car you wanted." But I ultimately felt. I mean, the campaign kind of went in a direction that I thought it would, and I'm glad I made that decision. I'm comfortable with it. But final point. I was able to make that decision a little later in my career, where I knew that I wasn't going to be living under a bridge if I didn't do it. And I realized if I'd been 30 in that position, it might have been a lot tougher. And I talk to young consultants today who have these kind of conflicts very seriously, and they tell me that, they work, this idea of profit for purity, or purity for profit now. We can talk about that later. But they're, increasingly, I think, in uncomfortable moral conflicts, just because of the environment today.
I'm going to ask each of you a different question. Michael, obviously we know that you were at the podium during very difficult days of impeachment and all the rest. And I read where when it was over, somebody asked if you missed it. And your answer was, I'm glad I did it, glad when it was over, and glad to move on to something different in my life. Never occurred to any of us you'd become a theology professor. You have sort of traded the participant's role and the pundit's role for somebody who studies faith in public life. What, from the theological side of your work, what are the principles that ought to guide people to face these kind of decisions?
Well, knowing that you might ask that question, I left kind of my own personal journey to answer that question. A lot came out of my time at the White House, and a lot of good things, and a lot of things that I'm very proud of. There was a lot of, remarkable things that happened during the Clinton presidency, but unfortunately my service there was so publicly associated with the whole Monica Lewinsky thing that was, shall I use the word, a little bit of a stain on my own record. And I felt I wanted something other than that on the epitaph at the end. But more importantly, the opportunity came to me to begin to explore my own faith and what it meant to me in the context of how we serve the common good that the bishop spoke of. Because my senior pastor at my little Methodist church out in suburban Maryland said when that service was over, well, good, now we've got something really important that we need for you to do, which turned out was to be the superintendent of the Sunday school at our church. I asked him, by the way, how did you select me for such an important position? He said, well, frankly, because nobody's been able to be convinced to do it in the last 10 years. So, but John, that it was in that process of imagining what role the church and people of faith can play to deal with the very poisoned and toxic environment that we have in politics now, that I began to wrestle with what does a common good look like in terms of our current political discourse, and how do people come together, and who brings people together to break down some of these severe barriers that exist. One of the reasons why we don't have political parties jostling for power, fighting for agendas, coming to points of compromise is because there's been a slow evaporation of what's the center in our American politics in terms of those who are elected. I mean, there's a great chart that I think everyone on the panel has seen that basically shows the complete collapse of those within our elected bodies, the House and the Senate, that are either called liberal Republicans or conservative Democrats, who routinely cross over and form different combinations in order to move issues forward. And it went from, the chart, which was done by the National Journal, by the way, shows about 344 members in 1982 who routinely moved back and forth across party lines in the House, shrinking down to exactly 4 today who play that kind of role. So I began to say, if in our institutions we're not seeing that ability to build a common good, where else might we look? Well, in civil society, one place where we know we have a captive audience on Sundays is in our parishes, our congregations, our churches, our temples, our mosques on Fridays. And that is maybe an opportunity for the church to speak to these broader concerns. Many of the principles that I think the bishop has outlined there, recognizing that one political party is not going to address all the moral implications satisfactorily for one person, and that there might be elements of the other party that bring things together. Well, what can we do to bring the church into a place that it plays that kind of role? Now, here is the problem. If everybody in this audience knows that. You walk in any of our churches on that Sunday morning and go up to the pastor and say, we've really got some political issues in this country, we need to hear you address them, the pastor runs out the door the other direction, not wanting to divide a congregation, knowing how divisive these issues are. So that brings me to, just in terms of pedagogy, what can a seminary do? What can we do in higher education to train future leaders of the church to play a better role, to bring people together for these conversations, to remind people what a common good looks like? And I think that's a critical role, and I think theological education has to begin addressing that. But that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing now.
This is probably the only audience that would appreciate that being press secretary to the president, spokesman for the State Department, all those campaigns, all that senators, the most challenging thing you ever did was try and organize Sunday school.
And also, any of those of you who know the Methodist Church who think that, you come out of that experience that I had thinking that you know something about politics until you walk into the United Methodist Church.
Exactly.
Well, your church seems completely obsessed by sex. I don't understand it. Michael, you and I are from Prince George's County. You were the first African-American statewide elected official, our lieutenant governor. You've been a first in terms of head of the National Republican Party. The first race I think you won was at John Carroll High School.
Yeah.
As student council president, which showed promise of things to come. But you have always been a little bit of a troublemaker wherever you went, and tried to stand up for some things. What'd you find as you tried to challenge your party? The point the bishop made about the racial identity of our parties. In Maryland, you got caught in the fight over the death penalty and stuff.
Yeah,
what are the lessons from all that?
Well, I guess I could start very quickly at the beginning. The overarching lesson that I've learned in all of those situations is that you can't please everyone, but you can certainly tick them all off at the same time. And I became very good at ticking people off because, as I've discovered about myself, I'm not a conformist. I am not a person who accepts the status quo just because, gee, we've always done it this way. I've always looked at ways to make people and institutions better. And to learn for myself how to make myself better in my leadership. My discovery is a very simple one, and it really comes out of understanding and appreciating that leadership is something that you should always be prepared to do, but more importantly, you should never be afraid to follow. And so part of the challenge, to Mike's point, that I've learned is people, once they get a hold of leadership, don't want to let it go. And they don't want to follow your idea or your idea or your idea because of the label that may be attached to you. So we personalized our politics in a real way, and it's unfortunate because you then cannot have the kinds of discussions that our nation really needs right now, very much in line with what the bishop outlined. Those 6 points are profoundly important for helping, I think, the political culture to appreciate the broader culture in our society and how they relate. One of the things that drove me as a young man, and oddly enough, it was something that I learned from Jimmy Carter, and particularly when he was running for president and he gave the Playboy interview and all of that. And out of that conversation, he said something that actually I modeled my public life after. And he said, and I want to quote him, he says, "I can't divorce my faith from public service. There can be no conflict between God's will and my political duty. If I violate one, I violate the other." And that's me. I've adopted that wholeheartedly. And at various points in my political career, I've had to stand in the well of my own consciousness and my faith tradition and battle. And one of them you raised was the death penalty. Our ticket in 2002, Bob Ehrlich, a dear friend, but he was very much a strong supporter of the death penalty. I am not, have not. I figured, my faith tradition is, pro-life. So, hey, want to be consistent. I can't in one breath argue for the life of an infant in the womb and in the next breath claim taking the life of someone sitting in a jail cell or something like that. So, but my responsibilities as lieutenant governor was to work with the governor in administering our death penalty in the state. And we had several cases that came before our office and had to sit there with the files and sit there in the room with the governor and the staff and the lawyers and walk through this process. And it was really an eye-opener for me to now confront in a real way my church's teaching, my own belief system, my own value system, because I had the life of an individual in a folder that had just been placed in front of me. And everyone in the room is making the case for the death. And I'm reading the file, I'm going, my Lord, he did that, and then he did this, and then this is what happened, and he killed this young woman, and he did. But I had to go deeper. I had to reach within myself, and I go back to the argument. What was I standing on? What was the foundation I'm standing on here? Am I standing on a foundation that's immovable or one that's flexible? Am I standing on something that's profoundly important or something that's in the moment? And so I'll never forget the moment. Everyone went around the table after reviewing the case, the first death penalty case, and that the governor was actually going to act on in 25, 30 years since they restored the death penalty in Maryland. And at the end, the governor came to me and he says, Lieutenant Governor, what are your thoughts? And I started by saying, I think everyone in this room knows where I stand. And I'm going to make the argument for life. And I only ask that you respect the argument and you listen. And for the next 20 minutes, I argued for life. And at the end of that, the governor looked at me and he said, thank you very much for sharing. And the members in the room, in the cabinet room with us, thanked me as well. And for me, it was this sense of, wow, there is a space in which you can still make the argument. Now, the governor ultimately decided to do what the governor thought was best, and this individual was executed. But for me, despite that outcome, being in the room to make the argument and to bring into that room the foundation of my church and my faith, and understanding that there could be no compromise. There could not be a compromise between God's will and my politics. That I could not sit back and violate one thinking that I would not somehow violate the other. And so I really do appreciate more so now the importance of those moments of bringing into the conversation. And I think that's what's gotten lost so much today, is that it's so easy to go to the political spot and just to settle there because I don't want to hear the noise. I don't want to hear the protest. I don't want to hear the complaints. I could have looked at the governor and said, you know, whatever you want to do, Governor, I'm your lieutenant governor, whatever. I have no vote here. I have no say here, but the governor gave me a vote. He gave me the say. And that's when you take that moment. That's when you make that moment, regardless of what the ultimate outcome may be. You have to be in that space to make the case, based on your values, based on your principles, based on your ideals. And I'm so sick and tired of hearing members of my own party throw those words out with absolutely no meaning. They just become political catchphrases. And until you have to actually confront in a life and death situation what that really looks like, what that really feels like, what those values really mean, what those principles and those ideals, what they really stand for, they're just words otherwise. And it's unfortunate.
Wow. Michael, one of the things people may not know is that you studied for the priesthood for 3 years.
I was in the Augustinian seminary.
Is that where you read Playboy? No. I was in the seminary that was not in the library.
No, that was...
Thank you.
I can't even begin to express it.
Let's turn to Kathy. If you quote Playboy, we're in trouble.
Don't worry, I'm not going there.
You talked about how you came into politics. You were a dietitian. Mm-hmm. You're part of a family landscaping business. You're the first Democrat in a long time to represent your district, first woman in that part of Pennsylvania. You arrive as a freshman member. You're pro-life, as you said. The first time I really watched you was at a House Rules Committee meeting at midnight. It was during the battle to pass healthcare reform and the battle that the bishops and others were involved in to try and keep abortion funding out of that. And there were a group of House Democrats who went to the Rules Committee and were lectured by the leadership on what they were doing, which was trying to keep abortion funding sort of the way it is. And I remember him saying, I know you guys, referring to Stupak and others, people, says, I don't know you, Mrs. Dahlkemper, Ms. Dahlkemper. Who are you? And your answer, I don't know if you remember it. I hope you do.
Well, as I remember it, you know, that was I want to step back an hour or two. I got a phone call coming out of dinner that night, and they said the speaker is going to let us take the amendment to rules, which shocked all of us. So I had gotten a call from Bart Stupak, and a number of us, we all met over at the Capitol building, and rumor was a number of things had gone on with some other members, and the speaker was saying, no, you're going to take the amendment to the floor. You got to take it through rules. So here I was sitting in the Rules Committee, ready to testify, in front of this committee about this amendment that we had all hoped, but really had little hope would be able to be moved forward. And it was at that moment that I sat there and I said, this is the reason why I'm in Congress. Right now, this moment, tonight. Because honestly, I didn't ever think I was ever going to run for any office. Somebody asked me around a table at a dinner party after a couple of bottles of wine to run for Congress. That's how it all happened. That is the honest truth. And that was January, and then I was obsessed with thinking about it. And by the next September after I was running for office. So this was a shock to me that I was even in Congress. And there was days when I would wonder, what am I here for? Because I really believe that we all have purpose in life, and we all have a reason why we're here, and the general reason for me is we're here to make the world a better place and to leave it better than we found it. So here I was in Congress, and the partisan nature of Congress became very apparent to me very quickly. And it's November, so I've been in Congress not quite a year yet, and in that room at that moment, I remember saying to God, this is the reason why I'm here. I know it now. For this moment, this time, to be here, and I have something to say in this hearing. And I didn't know exactly what it was going to be, but then that question came up, and I said, very poignantly, I said, I'm probably one of the only members of Congress who was a single mother, was a woman in college and had to make a tough decision, pregnant. And chose life, and was on welfare, was on food stamps, and raised a beautiful son who had just recently made me a grandmother for the first time. And I told my story there in front of the Rules Committee, which was televised. It usually isn't even televised, but that they had a camera in there that day. And I remember that the whole place was silent. The room was just silent as I was telling the story. And the chairman didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to say back at that point.
Talk a little bit about, that's about you and your integrity and your commitment. You're surrounded by a party that probably wasn't thrilled with you. You're surrounded by a right to life movement that probably wasn't thrilled with you. How do the partisan dimensions of an issue like that get twisted? People say they're about principle, and they end up getting deeply involved in partisan politics. And if you could, contrast that to your work now as a county executive.
Sure. So I come from a very pro-life district, and I was the first Democrat since 1976. So I think you really could go back to Roe v. Wade and just make a case for why I was the first Democrat in all of those years, even though we have a Democratic advantage registration-wise. But so I was actually pretty shocked because again, I was fairly naive coming into this whole thing. But I went to the Susan B. Anthony organization. They support pro-life women. And they endorsed my opponent, who was a pro-life man. And it became apparent fairly quickly that, it wasn't about being a woman. It was about the party that she belonged to. And so I found very little support. And people say, well, you want support, go to Emily's List. I'm like, well, I don't align with Emily's List, but I should align with these other groups, and they would not support me. So it's a very lonely place. I also think as a pro-life Democratic woman, I was a threat to both sides of the party, both sides of the aisle, I mean. For the Democrats, of course, I was a threat to the purity on that issue within the party, and I was outspoken on it. And on the Republican side, a pro-life Democrat, if you could start to get more of us and we would start to gain some traction, that's a big threat. I mean, I beat a 14-year, 7-term incumbent fairly far up on the Ways and Means Committee. That was a threat to them. So I was a threat on both sides of the aisle. So I was in a very lonely kind of place out there trying to figure out my way through. So, but you know, I guess I want to go back to the first question just for a minute, because when we talk about the partisan nature, I think where this all begins, and Michael, you said it begins for me with my moral conscience. And that was always my first, then it was my constituents. So coming from the kind of district I had, it was to my constituents. And then the last and the third place was the party. And that, unfortunately, isn't always the case. And the party's obviously trying to often push you to put them first and then the other two following. Now, as a county executive, one of the great things about being in a local office is the partisan issues that divide us on a national and often a state level really just kind of go away. It's all about good governance, because those are not the issues we're dealing with when it comes to policy. And I am a consistent pro-life, whole life, as I call myself, Democrat, from sanctity, from conception to natural death. I run a prison now. You know, it's about respect for people, but it's about good governance. And so on the local level, it's very refreshing.
Yeah. Mark, yeah, you and I were fellows at Harvard, and I got to know you and Annie. And I don't know if you recall it, but what they did when we first arrived is they sort of paraded us around to all the groups on who they had and who would be available for these things. And it got fairly dull as we each gave our 3-minute spiel on where we were from and what we had done. And they didn't know us from Adam. They certainly didn't know me. My son, when I was named a fellow at Harvard, asked if we were talking the real Harvard. You know,
Harvard Online.
It turns out what a fellow does is you talk and you eat, and I'm good at those things. So I know Mark's background really well because I've heard it about 24 times, and we were at the Harvard Club, and for about the 8th of these, and I was the first one called on, and I looked straight out into the audience and I said, "Hello, my name is Mark McKinnon. I used to be a songwriter for Chris Christopherson. I worked with Democrats in Texas, and then I met a guy named George W. Bush, and I became convinced, and now I work to try and realize the vision of compassionate conservatism, and now I'm working." And so I feel like I really know your background. What you have been is in the middle of politics. You know, Morning Joe, Daily Beast, you write about it. We're in the middle of this partisan intensity that Michael talked about. Where can we find space for these two and others to be true to who they are?
Great, thanks, John. Well, when I tried to say I was John Carr, everybody immediately knew the joke was in because nobody knows an ounce of holiness about me. First of all, you know, some people, not many, try to make the argument that, oh, you know, we've had really partisan times in our past. But anybody who's been around for any length of time in politics, like Mark Shields here, who covered the Roosevelt administration, I mean the first one. would tell you that, I think would agree that it's a really different time. And we could talk all night about those reasons, but that's not what we're here to talk about it. But I think we can all recognize that it's a distinctly different time that is causing a real significant paralysis in the system, which has huge consequences. But I'm here to tell you that there's some light in the tunnel. A few years ago, a number of us who are really concerned about that started an organization called No Labels. And it's been a fascinating evolution of that. But the reason that we did it is because we ran into so many people, particularly outside of Washington, who are so frustrated with what they see, and they want to do something and say, what can we do? And we realized that what we want to do is try and throw a net around the energy of all those Americans who are fed up with the system to try and apply some pressure to reward civil dialogue and bipartisan behavior, because right now the system rewards just the opposite. It rewards partisan behavior. And so it's been, as I said, a fascinating evolution over the last 4 years now, I guess. But we're making some great progress. So I'm here to report to tell you there is light at the end of the tunnel. And just quickly summarize a couple things that are going on. We started about a year ago and said, you know, we've got to get Congress bought into this idea. And part of it was just starting to rebuild trust. Really simple things that most Americans would think already happened, like actually getting in the same room together. One of our co-chairmen, Joe Manchin, the other one's John Huntsman, but Joe Manchin, as a senator, Democratic senator from West Virginia, he said he'd been up here 2 years and never had a formal meeting with a Republican. He's a Democrat. And so he said, let's just start by getting people in a room together, because it's much harder to demonize people when you get to know them personally. So anyway, we said, let's start what we call a problem solvers caucus. And it's, and the idea was, and it was broadly the whole political spectrum. If you were willing to come into a room and meet and work together and talk together about some ideas, co-sponsor legislation, then you could be part of this No Labels Problem Solvers Coalition. Well, when we started it, our ambition was to get to 50, because if we thought we had 50, that could be a meaningful block of voters. And the leadership kind of patted us on the head and said, come back to us when you get 70, assuming we'd never get to 70. And as I said, we started that about a year ago, and our goal was to get 50 members of Congress. When we announced we could only get 20. But as of today, we have 94 members of Congress and Senate who have signed up, are meeting regularly, have written and filed and co-sponsored 17 pieces of legislation, passed 3 of them. So it's working, and it's been amazing to watch as these people, there's some Tea Party people and there's some move-on Democrats, and when they get in a room together, it's been fascinating to watch what happens when they get in the room together. And it's been productive and rewarding. And, we've gone from a discussion about could we get to 50 to now having a conversation about, well, maybe we should cap this, because at a certain point, maybe it starts to lose meaning if everybody says they're a problem solver. So we have metrics and things. But so I could go on about that, but that's a, we're getting some traction, and it's incremental, but I feel the pendulum starting to turn as America. It is a democracy, and ultimately it does respond. It's just tougher these days because of all the money and some of the things the bishop referred to that kind of disincentivize the right behavior.
Why don't we turn to you, and I think we're going to have a couple mics down here and take a few minutes for your questions. This is not the time for the speech you've been dying to give. This is a time for a question to a member of the panel or the panel as a whole. So, in light of what you've heard, what do you want to ask? Come on down, Walt.
Hi, my name's Walt Grazer. I used to work for John for many years. My question picks up where you left off, Mark, which is what about the role of money? We hear a lot, about money and about now it's getting personal, meaning billionaires and so forth. And so I just want your comments about how money distorts our attempt to have a national conversation about some of these issues. Thanks.
Happy to start that off. I couldn't agree more. It's a real passion of mine, and it's a very frustrating, because, as you may know, the Supreme Court has ruled some significant rulings in the last few years that have really not only not addressed the problem, but really exacerbated the problem. But I do think it's infected our politics, and it's when office holders have to spend 80% of their time raising money. And I'm going to let Mike McCurry tell you about a great idea that he has, but he also told me about, I'm going to steal another one of your ideas, Mike. I'm going to let you tell the idea about the timeouts. Can I take your the money idea?
Yes.
Or do you want it? You want it?
Well, credit it properly. I'm going to credit it.
All right, I'm going to. I'm only going to steal one of his ideas.
Bipartisan moment.
Okay, this is bipartisan. But listen, I've been working on these issues of politics, money, and reform for a long, long time. And part of the frustrating thing about it is that there just aren't any new ideas. We've been just going to feel like we're wrapped around the axle about public financing, this and that, and nothing seems to work, and there's just an absence of new ideas. And Mike just told me about this great new idea, and I think there's going to be an editorial about it soon from Fred Hyatt in the Washington Post. But think about this. What if you had a rule that, this is sort of counterintuitive, doing it just the opposite way. Although what we talk about now is disclosure. Let's just make sure that it's okay if people give a lot of money, but let's just make sure we know who's giving it. What if you did just the opposite? What if you said no disclosure and made it a felony to disclose how much money anybody gave a candidate, and it went into like an Federal Election Commission pot if you gave money to somebody and they distributed it to the candidate? That's a really interesting idea. Think about that. If nobody knew where the money came from, interesting idea. So,
And the point being that your motivation to support would be because you support a broad agenda that you think a candidate stands for, and that the nobility of supporting that kind of politics would compensate for the fact that people wouldn't get what they feel they get now, which is an access to a conversation and an influence in that conversation, which is the negative, the toxic influence that I think we see in money. I personally feel so much money, so many gobs of money are being raised now. I don't know what campaigns can spend it on, Mark, that make it effective. And I don't know that is the real problem. In fact, I think it's increasingly true that members of Congress and politicians that have to go out and raise this money, it makes them feel dirty, it makes them feel like whores, and they probably don't like a lot of the people that they have to go ask to give them money in the first place. So I'm not sure that the pernicious impact that we suddenly imagine is coming about because of this money is there. But I do think that if we had a whole different theory about how people could contribute and how they were motivated to contribute, that might help. Now, my other idea, which you didn't start on, but this, by the way, is a very good friend of mine, a guy named Bert Levine, a professor of political science at Rutgers, is the one who is resurrecting this idea. It's actually been around for a while, and he's actually going to put it forward in an op-ed piece pretty soon. The other idea, it goes to the heart, though, of what does it take to break down some of these divisions? And when you talk to members of Congress, and Kathy, you can comment on this, it's the lack of these relationships of trust that people don't have because they're not spending time together, they're not working together, they're not really figuring out what makes someone on the other side of the aisle tick. What is the reason for that? Because when they're here now, increasingly in these compressed periods of time, they're running around doing fundraisers and not spending time getting to know each other as colleagues. So my other idea is let's declare like a Tuesday morning, once a month when Congress is in session, a campaign finance free zone. No fundraisers allowed. The DCCC, the NRCC, all those campaign committees are not allowed to assist any member in running a campaign event from the hours of 8 to 10 on that particular Tuesday morning. And the requirement is you pick up the phone, you call someone on the other side of the aisle, or even someone in your own caucus that you don't know particularly well, and go out and have breakfast somewhere and just get to know someone and start building relationships that might make a difference in the long term.
Mark made fun of that young reporter, Mark Shields. I've heard Mark say that part of the problem is not the votes that money buys, it's the positions that never get taken because of money. Yeah. That you don't, if you're a Democrat, you don't talk about some restrictions on abortion that you really support, even though you're pro-choice, because Emily's List or somebody will get mad. If you're a Republican who believes there might have to be some additional revenues for a real budget deal, you can't say that because the Club for Growth will come after you. So it's not just the positions taken, it's the positions that are never taken because of fear for the financial or political consequences. Great. Kathy.
Hi, thank you all for being here. This has been a really interesting conversation. My name is Kathy Saley, and I used to work with John at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. He did not pay Walt and I to ask these questions, but, and I'm now at a nonpartisan think tank that works on low-income issues, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And I always said when I worked for church that the politics on the Hill was baby play compared to the politics in church. And so I wonder if this is unique to the United States, this partisanship, because we see it in our politics, but we also see it in our churches and our faith traditions. And is that because we're fiercely independent, it's just part of our U.S. American culture? Or is that because our country is also so intertwined in our faith and that's important to us as much as our politics? And open to anyone, although maybe our professor of theology wants to take the first stab at that.
Well, I mean, it is because so deeply woven in our DNA is the concept of religious freedom and the ability to worship as we see fit, and that was central to the founding and central to the development of our country early on. It does play a much stronger role in our political culture than it does in other, at least Western industrial democracies. So it is somewhat unique. But we are very careful about how we state that because of that exact reason. Separation of church and state is an important principle that we acknowledge, because we don't want religion to establish some kind of theocratic approach to the way in which we collectively have to imagine these issues that arise from our faith. But to separate church and state is not the same as to separate religion and politics, because the latter, you see where the influences are. Now, they have been interesting as you look back in time, as the kind of the morphing of, I mean, you go back into the 60s when the prophetic voice of the church was so strong in support of civil rights. I mean, Dr. King's letter from the jail in Birmingham was a letter to white ministers. It was a theological document. But then we then see the rise of moral majority and different elements of what we call the Christian right coming in. So there's a contest back and forth here, and it is unique to our culture. But underneath that is something different. It's not just about politics and religion. It's about the different patterns and ways in which we live in community. And I think that's why you see, correctly, similarities in what happens within the political dysfunctions that exist within our political institutions, and then some of the same things that happen in churches and happen in higher education, frankly, and other places where the culture wars begin to invade. And I think that's because the way and patterns and how we socialize and live together is so different now. And that is where the real impact is. We don't have that strong sense of a bond of neighborhood and community that used to exist. We barely know the people that live next door to us, no matter where we live. And I think that change in our social structure has had greater impact on our political culture than anything else. Now, that's a long-winded academic answer, but it is something that I think goes to the heart of the American community. And there are a couple of new books coming out that I think are really interesting in looking and examining exactly that thesis.
May I ask a question on that point? Because you're raising an interesting thought. So which comes first? Does our politics drive our faith, or does our faith drive our politics? And I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a young man when I was running for the U.S. Senate in 2006, and he, up in Baltimore, came up to me and we were talking, and he said, I would really, love to support you, but the problem I have is that your party has all of these other issues. And so we kind of delved into that a little bit. And what it turned out was, his summation was, I go to church on Sunday, and my pastor beats me up for 4 hours on Sunday about how to live my life. He said, but I don't need a political party to do that to me Monday through Saturday. And it really got me thinking about what are the driving forces today in the body politics, and how does that come about? And what role should our pastors and priests and ministers and imams and rabbis play in helping us pull the two apart? You talked about the moral majority and all of that. Well, the moral majoritism of the 1980s has faded into something else today. And the question is, as we discover, what is that? But I still think that when you look at the emergence of that, it was sort of the religious community figuring out how to use their political clout, and the politics recognizing there were a block of votes, and the two married up. And so the question is, how do you go about that decoupling if that's where the country should be headed? And what is the ultimate impact of that? For that young man who doesn't want a political party to tell him how to live his life, but a political party that feels, well, no one else is, so we should.
Well, that question of how it all fits together is at the heart of our initiative. The other thought is you could have told him to become a Catholic and we'd beat him up for only an hour.
I knew he was going to say that.
Kieran.
That's good.
Hello, I'm Kieran Haller, and I'm a senior here at Georgetown and also work for John in the initiative. But
is there anyone back there who's independent?
And I'm just wondering, you've all talked about how your different faith and moral backgrounds have influenced different policy stances you have to take. And I'm wondering how your faith backgrounds influence or encourage you to reach across the aisle and engage in dialogue with members of a different party.
Well,
Let me suggest something. We have Reverend Jones here, and we expect Marcy Captor here shortly. Can I ask the folks who are in line to share quickly their thoughts, and then I'll ask members of the panel to pick one or both, one or two to respond to, so we can try and get a number of ideas out here, and then we expect the two Congress people to join us. Shep, why don't you start, and if you guys would come on down.
I'm Shep Abel. I never worked for John Carr. But I have a question that maybe Ms. Dahlkemper would be the best to answer, but you others would have ideas as well. I'm a pro-life Democrat, and I applaud your stance on that. There must have been many times when you're in the caucus, though, where you think, here's something, it's not exactly a deep moral issue, but I really think the party orthodoxy is wrong on this, not the best policy solution. But I'm going to sublimate that because I think it's really important to stand behind my party and form a unified group that can really push ahead. Never doing something that I think is wrong, but sometimes going along with things that I don't think is the best policy. So what's that side of partisanship?
Okay, over here.
My name is Rick Barry. I've worked in political communications. I now do communications for a network of churches. I've actually done some volunteer comms work with Colin over at No Labels. At the start of the evening, Bishop McElroy talked about the unique ability of parties to get people engaged in the process, but America's turnout numbers are abysmal. I've worked on campaigns. I understand that parties are really good at turning out sure votes and work really hard to suppress anyone whose vote is ambiguous to them or anyone whose vote may dissent from their party line. I'm wondering what you all, in your vast array of experience between the church and politics, see as opportunities for the church to catch people who fall through that gap and promote broader engagement amongst people who aren't necessarily sure R's or sure D's.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Colin Steele. I work at Georgetown, but not for John. And thanks for coming, especially Michael Steele, who shares my name.
There you go, bro.
And I have a question actually based somewhat on what you had to say, which is, how do you think it works when we have a whole variety of people in public life who are all trying to interpret both God's will and their political duty together individually, if that makes sense? Because I think some of that relates to partisanship, especially the extra partisan functions of the punditry that support the parties but aren't actually the parties, that are so much a factor in political life these days.
Okay. Chris?
Good evening. My name is Chris Stormont. You guys are doing a great job. My question is, if we were to achieve some kind of political perestroika, would it come from the ground up organically, groundswell from the people, or put another way, if Obama was a composite of Abe Lincoln and LBJ and maybe throw in Clinton and Teddy Roosevelt, could he have, in retrospect, could he have made a big difference from the top down, because I remember Bush talking about pulling us together, and I'm just curious as to how we're going to get there.
Okay, what do you owe your party when it's not a matter of fundamental moral principle? How do you get more people to participate? How will new energy come for bipartisanship, bottom up? How do you determine God's will versus political imperatives? Any or all of those? Why don't we begin with Kathy?
I'll take on the question of the solidarity. And I think there are times when to move your party's agenda, and it's not anything, as I said, I had my test, it's the conscience, it's the constituents, and then it's the party. And if the first two are okay, then I can go along with the party, even though it may not be the perfect policy. And part of that is, part of it may be trying to get a win for something you want further down the road that, that is going to be important to me and my constituents. So there is that piece of that too, the politics side of this, and trying to gain some kind of, you know, especially coming as a new member, you know, you've got to gain some kind of allegiance with some people and trying to move some things forward. So, but there is a solidarity. I mean, you know, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you're there, and there is some party solidarity that has to happen in those caucuses. And there's a lot of, each group has their own caucus meetings, and there's a lot of back and forth that goes on in those rooms. And as people are trying to sway you one way or the other as whether you're going to vote yes on this particular item. And on a day-to-day basis, many of the issues are not, we're not talking healthcare, we're not talking major energy policy, we're talking policy that will just tweak something a little bit one way or a little bit another way. And those are times when I think the party solidarity is much easier to fall into.
Michael, do you want to take one of those?
Yeah, I'll take the question about the God's will in the political party. The fact is that they really are kind of the yin and the yang, and the question is, how do you find that space in which you can have that conversation when you're looking at your opponent across the aisle? I think that moral foundation is the space in which you find consensus, and you don't have to feel threatened or feel that you're giving up something. I don't use the word compromise in politics today because it has taken on such an ugly connotation that says I have to give up something in order for us to reach agreement. So you win, I lose, zero sum. So I'm not compromising. And we've seen this played out since literally the day Barack Obama took the oath of office. And so the fact of the matter is, when you're coming from a place where there is a moral underpinning that is forming your view on policy, whether you have a social justice teaching, whether you have an economic philosophy, whatever it happens to be, I've come to appreciate that the space that we all need to gravitate into is where you are reaching that consensus, and that underpinning, that faith tradition, God's will, however you want to term it, is really kind of the force that's going to marinate you and your opponent in a way that leads to some consensus. I don't have to give up anything, you have to give up anything, because the greater good is what we're going to do for this community or for that person. And you bring those values into the discussion. What we're seeing in Washington and in some state capitals is a valueless discussion. And I'm not throwing around the term just to throw it around. I mean really pinned to something that really relates to this nation, one nation under God theme, and all the other theological aspects that have kind of formed the tradition of the country politically are no longer part of that discussion. And I think the more we go back to that and rely on that, I think you'll begin to see some of the changes, which is kind of the orientation that you get with the no labels, is the sense that let's shed the stuff that creates the noise and the confusion and focus on the thing that really we do have in common. And what is the goal? What is the consensus we're trying to reach here around a particular policy point of view?
John, can I?
Okay. Mark?
Mike was jumping in.
Yeah, I was just going to jump because I want to add on that, and then I'll do one or two the other points too. To quote Wesley, I think he said that to unite the pair so often divided, vital piety and knowledge. It goes to the heart of the question: how do you take individual faith and your own spiritual approach and put it into real action and do something with it? I think that is the task. Those are not, we often see those as two separate things, but they have to come together. And by the way, I'll put in a plug, not that I'm plugging Hillary Clinton, but always happy to, but she gave a great talk on Saturday down to a convention of United Methodist women on exactly that point. And that another point I would make is hearing our politicians talk more about how their faith informs what they do is a good thing, not a bad thing. And we don't get enough of that, so I'd like to see more of that. To the question about where will perestroika come from? What's actually going to change? I'm encouraged that I see among young people a much more pragmatic, fresh approach on these issues. I think part of this is generational change. I think if we've got too many near baby boomers on this panel, And I think once we begin to exit stage left and a new generation steps in, I think some of this friction and gridlock and dysfunction will begin to melt away. At least I hope it will. And then my last point is to just be mindful of the great commandment. What does it take to reach across the aisle, which was the first question the young man wrote. What it takes is to really live out that great commandment, that you love God with all your heart and mind and soul, and your neighbor as yourself. I think if we had a golden rule approach in politics where when you see someone who is been unfairly attacked, particularly someone on the other side, and reach out and express some remorse for what's happened. And maybe even if you're like me and Mark, guys who've been in the political world, tell some young kid at the DCCC, don't write press releases like that. Don't say things like that, because that demeans this process. We maybe need a little more adult supervision from guys like McKinnon.
And to that point, I think this is actually, I was sitting here thinking about that we who are in politics, whether it be the candidate, the elected official, or those who are consultants or running an organization that's supporting one kind of issue or another, it seems that we should be held to a higher standard of truth. Yeah. And we have the resources, we have the ability to get out the message, and yet we are not held to that higher standard in any way, shape, or form. And that to me is a huge piece of this partisan divide that we've seen.
Mark, was John Wesley a Franciscan or a Jesuit?
See, he's smoking me out. I think that I can combine a couple of questions. I think we will have covered most of the bases. The question was ultimately, is it from the bottom up, and what will change things? The answer is yes, it is from the bottom up. This is a democracy, and ultimately what office holders care about is getting reelected. Now, it's just tougher these days because of the way the system's rigged. It's just, they're responsive to other things like these special interests who are making their elections harder or easier, so they respond to these special interest moneyed groups and organizations. But when the people really rise up, the elected officials will listen, and I'm encouraged. I'm a glass half full guy, but picking up a little bit on what Mike said, John and I had an opportunity to be at Harvard together, as he mentioned, and it really inspired me to see the young students today and their whole mindset, which is very interesting. It's very unique, very different than my generation. They are it's a huge generalization, of course, but I'd say that they have a real civic-minded they have some civic-minded chromosomes. I mean, there's a bias toward participation and wanting to make the world better, mixed in with a dose of healthy skepticism about the system and the traditional channels like the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. I think they are much less ideological than the generations before them. And that's, by the way, why we're seeing increasing number of people who identify themselves not as Republicans or Democrats, but as independents. And that bulge is coming through the snake. But I'm also excited because they're not just saying, the system doesn't work and I'm going to be apathetic. They're finding new ways to bend the universe. And a lot of it can be through their faith and churches and synagogues and mosques. But a lot of them also are finding, they also have a very entrepreneurial approach, I think, which is really good. So they're finding new ways to exert their smarts, intelligence, and passion, but it's not traditional. It's not necessarily through the Democratic Republican Party. They're doing it through NGOs, churches. They're finding other ways to do it, which is good because the old ways just don't work very well. So that's where I think there's a real note of optimism for the future.
Please join me in thanking our panel. Congressman? What? You need to remind them of something. Could I ask Congressman Jones to join us up here?
Very good, Walter Jones. Good to see you.
Well done, sir.
Thank you very, very much.
Chairman, good to see you. Walter Jones. Good to see you again.
Hi, Congressman.
Where's
John
Marcia
Carr.
Cat?
She's coming. We're told.
She's my buddy.
Congressman, you're not going to have to answer for both Democrats and Republicans.
I get accused of that many
Yeah.
times.
First of all, welcome to Georgetown,
Thank you,
and thank you for coming out. The House had votes tonight. There was a lot going on, and we were told that Representative Capter will be with us quickly. You have a remarkable background for this topic. You're more ecumenical than most. I'm told you were raised a Southern Baptist and became a Catholic. Good
1977.
choice.
I've been very happy. Very happy.
You were a Democrat at one point and became a Republican. You're a member of the Republican caucus who has raised fundamental questions about the Iraq War.
Absolutely, yeah.
You support the minimum wage. You voted against some of the economic policies of this party, and you paid a price. They took a committee assignment from you. You don't remember me, but I remember you. We were in a meeting of Catholic members of Congress, and it was not a very good meeting. People were railing against the bishops, and why don't they do this, and why don't they do that, and that's and that and that. And you took the floor, and you said, I became a Catholic because of its teaching and the Eucharist, and I'm really worried about my faith and my soul because of the position I took on the war. And the entire room got dead silence. You actually live out what we've been talking about here in terms of trying to match public service, faith, conscience, and loyalty to party. Can you talk about how you do that? You have constituents, you have principles, you have a party, you paid a price. How do you put that all together?
John, it started when I walked to the floor of the House the night that we voted to give President Bush the authority to go into Iraq, or to have the option to go in. And I turned to my chief of staff, who's still with me, and I said, Glenn, I do not believe the information we've been given in a classified setting. Yet I don't have the courage to say to the 60,000 retired military in my district, the home of Camp Lejeune Marine Base, Cherry Point Marine Air Station, that I'm going to give the President my vote with the hope that he will not go into Iraq. That was a weakness on my part. And quite frankly, after the President went into Iraq, that I went to the funeral of Michael Bitts, who was a sergeant killed the first week we went into Iraq. I sat there with his wife, Janina, and I realized that what I had done had to be offensive to God. That if I profess to be a human being who happens to be a Catholic, who believes in pro-life, then why wouldn't that 18, 19, 21, 34-year-old individual be a child of God just as much as the baby in the womb? From that day forward, I made my decision that I, from then on, would listen to God when I made my decisions, and I would vote my conscience. And already they have spent $1.2 million to take me out in a primary that will be held next Tuesday. I think when I took the position of having a timetable to bring our troops home from Iraq in 2005, I stood at a news conference with Dennis Kucinich, who's a very, very dear friend of mine, who had not voted to give President Bush the authority. Ron Paul, who's another very dear friend of mine, who did not vote to give the President the authority. Also, Neil Abercrombie, who is now the governor of Hawaii, and I had voted to give the President the authority. And from that day forward, for me personally, I am proud to be a Republican. But there's a bigger calling for our country than being a Republican or a Democrat, quite frankly. And so for me, as you made mention, I was one of 4 that was asked off of a committee about a year ago by Mr. Boehner. I enjoyed your first panel that I had the privilege to hear. To me, the biggest problem in Washington is money. I think it is worse now than it was in 1995 when I was elected in 94 and sworn in with Newt Gingrich in 95. It continues to influence policy, and the policy is not based on whether it's a good idea by a Democrat or a good idea by a Republican. It's what's going to be the influence of Wall Street. I did not vote to bail out Wall Street, but you can see already Wall Street's putting a great deal of money into taking me out. Well, that's the game we're in right now. It's not a game of policy, it's a game of money and politics.
Wow, that's quite a story. You were voted, read this, one of the hardest working members of Congress, and you were voted the nicest member of Congress. Yeah. Are those problems in Washington?
Well, I've never known many men that were Mr. Congeniality, but I'm the first, I guess. No, it's it's an honor. I'm from the South. I'm from North Carolina, for those that don't know much about me, and I was raised a Southern Baptist. You were exactly right. But it was a small town, still is a small town. I was born there. I'll be buried there one day. And that was just the way life was. You said good morning to the stranger. You said thank you to the stranger. You never questioned who he or she might be or what color skin they might be. You just always were taught to speak in a respectful way.
What do you think has happened to our politics that what Michael talked about, what Kathy talked about, what the consultants talked about, you are such an exception to politics. What do you think you owe your party, and what do you think you don't owe your party?
Well, I joined the Republican Party. I was a Democrat in the State House, and you might remember my father served 26 years as a Democratic congressman and became a chairman of a major committee. And I joined the Republican Party because I felt that the party was the strongest advocate for the unborn and the strongest advocate for marriage between man and woman. And quite frankly, the groups that are coming after me now, we've done some research, and they had individually and collectively spent about $12 million a few years ago to defeat the marriage amendment in California. I see a direction that bothers me about the party. This is my feelings, obviously, but if the party is a little bit ashamed to say that we will stand for the unborn, we will stand for marriage between man and woman, then my limited knowledge of history, and that's what I majored in, would tell me that every great civilization, every great nation that forgot its foundation crumbles. And I think with economic problems facing our nation, we are a debtor nation. We cannot pay our bills without going to the foreign markets and getting someone to buy our dollars as an investment. And we continue to spend and spend and spend what we don't have. And we cut programs left and right for children and senior citizens. And I'm very disappointed in the leadership of our party, and that's not because I was asked off the committee.
What do other members say to you? Do they regard you as somebody who is not in solidarity? They probably use stronger words. Do they regard you as a profile in courage? Do they regard you as somebody from a different day? When you're talking privately and you talk about why you take these positions, what do other members say about their own choices and their own behaviors?
Well, I go back very briefly to the Iraq War. After we'd been there 2 or 3 years, and I came out against the war, I had several of my friends, when we joined at the news conference, we were asking for a timetable to bring the troops out. And I had several of my Republican friends to say, and I say this modestly, believe me, because Jesus Christ was a man of humility. I try to live in that light of Christ. And they said, I wish we had the courage that you had to come out against the war. That's why I carry the poster that's in front of us, John. You can't see it, but it's I have about 30 or 40 of these, and I will not go to a civic club. I will not speak on the floor about Afghanistan without taking a poster to show the pain of war. That poster is a little girl holding her mom's hands, and she's got a thumb in her mouth, and she's wondering why her daddy is in the flag-draped coffin. This country has forgotten the pain of war, and I just don't understand. I think the internet is a wonderful thing, but too many people would rather vent their anger on a message on the internet than to get out and protest. They don't protest anymore. I doubt, and I'm not talking about Georgetown, I'm not talking about anybody here tonight, but probably if you wanted to have a rally in front of the White House about 10 more years of spending billions every month in Afghanistan, and we have very little accountability while we're cutting programs for children and senior citizens, I doubt if you could get 100 people to show up. And that's sad to me.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Pope Francis is going to make a difference in our lives, obviously, but in the lives of our leaders? We now have the president talking about Pope Francis. We have Paul Ryan talking about Pope Francis. Lots of other people. What do you think leadership can do, in this case, the leadership of our church?
Well, I think he is a great man of God. I think he is going to continue to bring smiles to the face of God because of his advocacy for, in many respects, his advocacy for different issues that I believe sincerely that be Catholic or Baptist or Methodist, it does not matter, be Jewish, be Muslim, that God needs for this country to come back to the love of God and start taking care of the American people and their needs. And this way maybe the bishop or the father would be upset with me, but when America cannot create more jobs because we became greedy and sold our jobs out overseas with these trade agreements, that we need to come back, we need the leadership to rebuild America.
I think Marcy, when she gets here, will agree with you on that.
We agree on a lot of things, we really do.
Well, why don't I start asking you her questions?
Well, I'm on her bill about Glass-Steagall to reinstate Glass-Steagall. So,
this is really inappropriate, but I'm going to try and ask it anyway. How did you come to become a Catholic, and how did that impact your public service?
Well, I went to Hargrave Military School, and she's coming, I think.
Keep going.
You got a sign. In Chatham, Virginia, before people were 6'9", 6'10", with hopes of playing college basketball. And I met a gentleman named Jim Ahern from Providence, Rhode Island, who was a devout Catholic. Never mentioned his faith to me, not one time. And I was going to the Baptist church. They would take all the cadets to the churches where they were members. And then at a period of time before my daughter was born, I found out my wife was pregnant. We had gone away from religion, quite frankly. And I remember how devout Jim was. And I decided that I wanted to know more about the Catholic religion. I want to know more about the faith. And I went to the local priest, Father Anthony Giacomini, who's Italian, and told him that I wanted to come to the little church in Farmville and sit there and listen. And I bought books, and I just learned more about the Catholic faith, and it was what I needed in my life, and I've never regretted one day of converting to Catholicism, not one day.
Well, we're honored to have you with us.
Well, here comes Marcy, so thank you.
Welcome, Congressman Capter. You'll be happy to know that Representative Jones has answered your questions.
Good. I trust you.
I couldn't do that. Yeah. Thank you, sweetheart. Thank you.
John,
Thank you so
my
much.
friend. Great to see you.
We've had a great discussion. I know you've been on the Hill and other things. I thank you for late in the evening coming to join us. Marcy and I knew each other when we were kids.
That's right.
Literally in the 70s. Monsignor Gino Baroni was a great mentor to both of us. And she went home, won.
He recruited me to run.
Yeah. And we thought that'd be good for 2, 4, 6 years. How many terms?
This is number 16.
You are the most senior woman. You got to say this in the right way. The most senior woman in the House of Representatives. You've been on committees that no other woman has been on. You've been a leader in lots of ways for your party, but you've also been someone that stood up for what you believe, whether it was free trade, whether it was monetary policy, whether it was Eastern Europe, whether it was abortion funding. You had the remarkable experience of going in the last election and defeating both Dennis Kucinich and Joe the Plumber.
And before that, I had a Nazi reenactor who was a multimillionaire.
You want to talk to Marcy about this race?
I need her advice, yeah.
And you've come through it all. Part of it is because of who you are and where you stand. How do you put together what you believe, your loyalty to your party, and your faith, and your constituents?
It's all one. It's all, for me, it merges, so I don't, I have a very diverse constituency, probably one of the most diverse in the country. People of various faiths, and as I say to those who do not profess a faith, you keep the rest of us honest. And they laugh. They always laugh. They like that line. And so I think my faith sustains me because I have been in office now. That seems like a very long time when you say the numbers, but actually it seems so very brief. So very, very brief. And I always use the example, I'm the author of the bill that created the World War II Memorial, which was something the American people actually wanted. And we didn't use public funds, but it took us 17 years from the moment that the first bill was introduced to we actually dedicated the memorial in 2004. So it's 1987 to 2004. And it's Crexter, you shake your head. I shake my head. When I look at all the things that happen, and that was a very good lesson for me because I said, this is something the American people wanted. And it took that long, so it sobers you. But I think faith sustains us through all. It's I find myself sometimes saying, this is the moral position. They don't like to hear that on Capitol Hill. But in terms of Ukraine, current challenges in Ukraine and with Russia's invasion of a sovereign nation, forgetting the fact that we're even Americans, the world has a moral responsibility to Ukraine. It goes beyond country, it goes beyond political systems. So I find myself sometimes using the moral rudder that as Catholics we develop. And I was baptized, it was given to me, Walter. I didn't have, in a way, a free choice. You know, you always, down the road, you think about it and you cost compare and you do all these things with denominations. And I've learned a lot by going to different faith groups and religious denominations. And it's made me better as a person. So I've come to a greater appreciation of our country and the laws of our country. In terms of some official Catholic Church positions, as a member of Congress, you pay a heavy price if you even use certain words. It is true. And whether it's war and peace, whether it's issues that concern life, if you pay a price inside the institution just because of the fact that those certain people run for office and other people choose not to run and they form a majority of a point of view or whatever. And there are large amounts of money associated with certain positions. And some of the more controversial ones, both wings, the extremists, they use those issues to raise money on both sides of the aisle. And so you'll find don't make it too complicated. Just look at the flow of funds depending on certain issues, and you'll get a sense of certain positions being gamed, and it happens on a very regular basis. I didn't first see that when I was elected. I see it now. Walter probably has a similar experience.
I asked Walter, sort of what's the internal conversation? My experience is people admire you a lot, but they don't follow your example very often. What's it like inside when somebody says, you're a Democrat, you're a leader, you're a ranking member of this and that? How within the caucus, within the party, do you deal with the fact there are some things, whether it's trade agreements or, as you said, the life issue, where you stand up for your own values and your own constituents and people say, wait a minute, you belong to us.
Right.
We need you.
I don't know if you've ever been leered at, but I have been leered at with very angry eyes. You probably have been too, Walter.
That's right.
And so you sense that and you go, wow. You sometimes have a minority position, but you hold it and you try to compromise, and you feel rigidities inside the institution. And I'll use the pro-life issue as an example. When we were debating the Affordable Care Act, however you feel about the Affordable Care Act, I come from a family where our father, when I was rather young, became quite ill, and he had to sell his small grocery store, and that broke his heart. But he had no health insurance for his family, and he went to work in a factory in order to get health insurance. And I said, if I ever get a chance in Congress to vote on a program that would give every American, including small business people, a right to insurance, I am going to do it. And then we got in that big debate, and of course the life issue entered, and I worked very, very, very hard, and I do believe was the reason that we did pass legislation, because we were able to get language in there that provided a different flow of funds and to allow people not to use tax dollars for procedures that they didn't believe in. It gave people a choice. It didn't preclude those that would want those procedures, but it allowed for sort of an opt-out through an executive order. We couldn't get it passed in the bill, but we got the president's okay, and we signed an executive order, and I even drafted some of the words of that. And I can remember during that debate how some of my colleagues who didn't share my point of view were just so angry, because it wasn't a pure position, it was a compromised position. It tried to provide footing. And so what does it feel like? You really feel like an outcast sometimes in your own party. I can remember during the NAFTA debate when we tried to say that the result of NAFTA without provisions for continental adjustment for those who would lose their small farming operations in Mexico would create an exodus like this continent has never seen. And we tried to build in transitional provisions into that agreement. Those never happened, and all of the harm occurred in our country, in Mexico. Now look what's happened to Mexico. Its largest industry is illicit trafficking of drugs. And all that could have been prevented, maybe not all, but a great share of it. And I had to stand up to a president of my own party. And I can remember, the way he looked at me. But I really felt morally I was doing, and now I know we were confirmed by what happened since to our country, to Mexico, to the continent. I know we were correct. We could have prevented so much harm. And I really think I was informed in those views through my Catholic faith to take care of the least among us. I really do think that that is a very heavy core of who we are. So people define that in different ways. They don't always agree with you. I think also a preference for the poor, that is very much a part of who we are. And we keep, we default back to that, and you try to see how your votes impact those individuals. And what I've seen happen in the Congress, and I'll just end with this, when I was elected to the Congress 32 years ago, there were many more people who came from modest means. Today, even in the House, The majority arrive with vast assets. I just left something where the individual is a billionaire. I never knew a billionaire. I don't think Toledo has any billionaires. Maybe we have one. But anyway, it's just a whole different set of interests way on this institution. And they're not bad people, but they have a set of experiences that in no way is any way similar to what I and the majority of people, almost all the people I represent, what they face in their lives.
Would he like to support an initiative at Georgetown that would deal with some of yeah. I asked Representative Jones, what difference you think Pope Francis is going to make? This kind of leadership.
I hope he gets us back to fundamentals. I hope that I have very high hopes for him. And I come from a family of Franciscans, so you can imagine. Now, he's a Jesuit. So, I wonder about that. But he's politically smart. He selected the name of Francis. I thought, this is interesting. This is an interesting fellow. So I think that I was very impressed that on this commission that has been appointed dealing with some of the matters the church has to clean up internally, he appointed half women. I don't know that another pope would have done that. I was very pleased to see that because I'm upset with our church as a woman. There are twice as many sisters professed as priests, and they aren't treated, in my opinion, as I am treated as a member of Congress. They might not listen to me, but at least I have a chance to express my views, and I think that that's very important. So I hope that, he represents a new moment, and I think that we certainly live in a country where the middle class is shrinking, where we have so many in poverty. I have large numbers in my district: Cleveland, Lorain, Sandusky, Toledo. All you have to do is look at the census and see what's happened to people in this economy. So I hope Pope Francis really, he'll seed new hope and I think new inspiration. So I have great, I'm just very excited about his papacy.
Tonight we have had principles offered, I think, eloquently and thoughtfully by our bishop. We've had analysis and commentary offered by people who have been in the work, and we have example of people who live the vocation that the bishop talked to us about. Join me in thanking these two examples. It's been a long night, but a good night. I want to thank those who made it possible. I want to thank Scott Fleming. I want to thank Caitlin and Kieran and Lauren, who helped the President's Office and the Berkeley Center. I especially want to thank you for coming out for this discussion. There will be more like this. One last appeal. If you know young people under 40 who are in public life, work at the White House, work in the House, Democrats or Republicans, who are Catholic, under 40, we want to bring those folks together and talk about how their faith is an asset, not a burden, share our teaching in a way that empowers them to be the strongest, best public servants they can be. If you are that person, get us your name and email. If you know people like that on your staff or whatever, get us their names and emails. Our next session is not going to be for us. It's going to be for those young people in public life who have an opportunity to live out the principles that we've been talking tonight.
John, can I say something?
Sure.
I don't want to go over time here, and I do apologize for being late. I had 3 concurrent meetings this evening.
Well, a billionaire is a billionaire.
And a member. I wanted to just mention that the Catholic organizations that I go out to never ask for internships on the Hill. those younger people that you will attract, I think that is very important because I believe the Catholic denomination is still the largest in the Congress, and we need to bring young people through. I do it on my own, but I think this is really, the church has to meet the world, right? Church has to meet the world. And that's one way to do it. I also want to say, because my dear friend Walter Jones is here, I think he and I both agree the greatest corrosive force at work in today's politics is campaign finance. Amen. And if we do not change this for our country, I believe she's going down. We simply have to have, and the Catholic Church, through its various mechanisms, has to be a voice for this. I would come back for a session on that alone, John, so you could really understand as the American people what is going on. And pretty much what's going on is if you raise the most money inside the institution, you get the committee you want and you move ahead. And if you don't raise as much money, you don't get ahead, and it's wrong.
Well, that's a dose of reality, and on that basis, we'll conclude tonight's evening. Thank you for coming out. Thank you both.
Thank you.